Welcome to this evening. With geopolitics hotting up by the minute, can I give you an alarmingly warm welcome to this wisdom lab on peacemaking in wartime. My name is Dave Benson. I direct culture and discipleship for the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. And whether you're here in person or you're watching this online afterwards, it's brilliant to have you with us. LICC exists to help you make a difference wherever you are, following the way of Jesus in your particular context. But how do we capture the context we're in? How do we capture this cultural moment where it seems, once again, as some have put it, that we are stumbling potentially into a world war? Putin is on the march. China's cheering on. Donald's pulling back and NATO's on the brink. Benjamin bombs Gaza and Britain ups its brigades, and the drumbeat of war picks up pace. As international conflict escalates, how would Jesus, the Lord of Peace, have us seek shalom wherever we stand? And that is what this night is about. That's what we're here to explore. To have a better conversation that is primed by a panel of expert peacemakers. Over 5 perceptive articles, we have called for a peace witness amid Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. We've exposed the military-industrial complex walking backwards towards disarmament. We have come to the table with principles of relational peacemaking, and we have searched for God's image in war criminals. And all of this has been done in our everyday context, like peacemaking through RE, teaching that can explode the TikTok echo chambers, stoking war. I want to stand against the opportunistic cynicism of conflict entrepreneurs like Yuri Orlov. Has anyone seen this movie, Nicolas Cage in Lord of War? Very powerful movie about the arms industrial complex. I want to reject his statement in that movie that the arms dealers are going to inherit the earth because everybody else is too busy killing each other. Instead, we are doubling down. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. But do we believe that? Now, perhaps all of this sounds rather abstract and remote to you, snugly sitting here in the British Isles, separated maybe not by a large ocean, as some would say, but by channel and sea from brewing trouble. But I don't know if you've been reading the news or watching the news lately, but countless articles from politicos, military advisors, are saying that we may already be in World War III and not know it. Often it's named after the fact. We already have multiple nations involved either in battles or proxy wars in multiple locations, most definitely involving the great powers. NATO, America, Russia, backed by China and North Korea with boots on the ground. I'm not here to have an argument about whether we are or are not in World War III. What matters is this is a pivotal moment. And we're hearing resonances with 60s anthems of peace and 1940s and the dynamics going on there. We have our Prime Minister sitting in the next generation dreadnought nuclear sub, rattling his saber back in Putin's face, saying that we are ready for a fight, if need be, because we too are a nuclear power. If I zoom in on just one of the current 40 wars happening at the moment around the world, particularly on Russia-Ukraine, I'm wondering what this means for us as Christians in the UK. Are we ready to follow Christ amidst what seems like a looming battle? How will we respond? Is our character up to this? Will we flee in fear and deny our Lord? Or perhaps worse, will we weaponize our faith in Christian nationalism? This all became very real for me just last month when I joined one of our authors, Professor Joshua Searle, to visit 20 frontline workers in Ukraine. You can see my phone that popped up on one of the mornings, the night that that Zelensky's hometown was struck by missiles, and there was raids all across the Ukraine. I was woken up at 3:58 in the morning with about 10 alarms, including through the town. It felt very real. We were visiting 20 frontline workers in Ukraine, seeing how they have each pivoted in response to war. So I went there in partnership with Dnipro Hope Mission, an extraordinary, small, agile organisation in incarnational mission. They have since 2016, 2017, they've served over 100,000 Ukrainians in the toughest of times. And they desperately need your help. So I'd love if you do check them out. And for anyone watching connected with Dnipro Hope Mission, please keep going. We stand with you. So take, for instance, Alexei. Alexei is a pastor and a restaurant proprietor in Berdyansk. When his town was occupied, was overrun, he moved to central Ukraine. One of his businesses was taken over. He now runs a church offering trauma recovery for victims, both civilian and military. Just an everyday pastor. He's effectively circumnavigating the planet at breakneck speed every year, driving thousands of miles along the extensive battlefront as a chaplain who distributes food on the zero line. He prays, he cares for people, he runs local services, he leverages his business assets as numbers swell of people who are desperate for hope. I have with me his blood-stained badge of a chaplain from his service in Mariupol. He gave that as a gift. Very moving. Now, the sound quality is not great because this is essentially a home movie made by Alexei, showing some of what's happening. It goes for 3 minutes, but let's just watch through Alexei's eyes at what's happening on his front line right now and ask ourselves, are we ready for this, and how would we respond if we were dropped into the middle of this? Thanks, Andrew.
Hi friends, all brothers, sisters, all donors and partners in Dnipro Hope Mission. I want to say thank you so much for your standing with us this long time, this bad time. When we are outside, we are here in front line in Kherson area, and we distributed food, distributed kids gifts, and we celebrated here Christmas time. Thank you so much. You pray, you donate us, and you are standing with us in this difficult time. Thank you so much. It's a part of Russian peace, Russian war. They're shelling and shooting and around villages on this place, and this is just small part. I've been there a couple months ago, and here around all of this land, everywhere you can see that. But now it's a freedom territory, freedom place, and praise God, we wait our victory. Thank you so much for your standing with us. You're not forgot Ukrainian, and you stay with Ukrainian people. Thank you so much.
As you watch that video, how do you feel? If this was to be on our soil here, are we ready for this? What would it take to get everyday disciples ready? Or imagine that you are Margarita, pictured here, a wonderful 26-year-old who trained as an occupational therapist only to flee for your life and set up what she calls equilibrium projects. She works with traumatized kids and their mums through physical therapy and horse riding. They offer psychological support to find a way to live. I have her badge also that she gave as a gift. Or like my friend Veronica, who is here tonight. Welcome, Veronica. From my church in Beaconsfield, imagine that you're a young mum whose family has fallen apart with the war. You've gone from a safe job teaching to a refugee through Poland to a number of years later, moving into the UK, cleaning to keep things afloat with a daughter and a son trying to study in a foreign culture. I had the privilege of carrying letters from her family, letters of encouragement to these courageous Ukrainians on the front line, and was able to return with letters and gifts from Margarita, binding people together across the world. You see, this is real. War never stays at a distance. We're all in it now. Now, there is no doubt, as I discovered writing a recent Connecting with Culture, that opinions differ a little bit when it comes to geopolitics. We're going to clash at certain points. We will disagree. But the point of this event is not debating our views on events out there. This is not a geopolitics debate. The point is cultivating more fruitful ways to live and share the reign of God, making a difference where we already stand, wherever we are, whatever we do. So our task in this event is to work out how we will each respond, following the slain Lamb who rules from the cosmic throne without firing a bullet. Now, you're going to hear some incredible stories tonight. You will hear some profound wisdom. But it is all to help you become wise peacemakers, people who learn to follow the way of Jesus in their particular time and place. So this evening is structured around 4 questions, and you'll be engaging with each other in responding to these questions as well. We will listen to what's going on and why. We will imagine what should be going on. We'll then create a better response in our own context, and we'll learn how to communicate the gospel of peace. So would you pray with me now as we, before we welcome up our panel, and let's commit this night to the Lord. Let's pray. We pray to you, Jesus, as the Lord of all. Would you help us to listen, help us to share well, to receive your peace so that we can pass it on to others in the places you have called us to serve. For your glory. Amen. Now, before I welcome the panel, we do have a few people who contributed to the series who aren't on the panel tonight. Michael Schluter, we'll hear from him a little bit later in a video, although Mims was involved with her grandpa Michael putting the piece together. Joshua, I've spoken a little bit about in terms of Dnipro Hope. He's also a theologian. He's celebrating his 40th birthday in Northumbria tonight, so blessings to Joshua. Dr. Alan Storkey is with us, and he will lead off with the first comment and question in the Q&A and post-panel time. But would you please welcome up our panel as we move into an open discussion on this topic. Thank you very much. Where we're going to start here is each of us will just share a little bit about the context in which we confront war or the fallout from war, just so that we get a bit of a feel of who's on the panel tonight. So I might pass on firstly to Annie.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Annie. I went under Annabelle, my professional name, on my article. As you can see in my beautiful photo up there, I'm in front of one of my displays. I am a teacher, a secondary school teacher in North London. Religion Street is right behind me in that picture, and there's even a sneaky question, will war ever end? A conversation that comes up an awful lot. So my context is I teach children mainly from war-torn backgrounds. So it's a mainly Muslim school, Christians there too, asylum seekers, refugees, and a lot of the kids live in the hotel just opposite of the school. So we're getting them here, there, and everywhere. So that is my context.
Actually, I'll share that microphone. Yeah, go.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Alex Ferguson. I work for MEDA, which is a Christian humanitarian aid agency. I live here in the UK, but have spent the last 11 years working in different places around the world, different conflict settings. My MEDA career began the day that the civil war broke out in South Sudan. On the 15th of December 2013, my wife and I were on our way, and so this topic is one that this sort of is my day to day. Just as I was on the train on the way down, I had a message from a colleague in Sudan saying that there had just been 2 drone attacks on the airport near where they are. So I just had to sort of skip out into the back room just before the start of this meeting to go and sort of connect with my colleagues to check in on what was going on. And I've worked across different places in Africa, in the Middle East. And one of the wonderful things about being a humanitarian is we're not peacemakers in the formal sense. So we will often work alongside peacekeeping missions. But there's an amazing sort of privilege of being a humanitarian in that we get to be in these contexts, in these situations, and we get to observe, and we get to see up close the best and the worst of humanity, and how we can understand that humanity, how we can do that, and then how we can seek shalom in the midst of those contexts. So for us as MEDA, so that we're able to bring life-saving assistance into the context where we are.
Thanks, Alex. Now, Mims is co-emceeing with me, but Mims, tell us about the context in which you confront war.
Yeah, so my name is Mims. I am the Culture and Discipleship Project Lead here. And prior to that, I was working in Parliament with an MP, and that was sort of quite the space for conflict in many shapes and forms, be it the form of casework, be it the form of Homes for Ukraine. We consistently had constituents who needed our help from these war-torn countries. And then I also had the privilege of working with my grandfather in my gap year. So I actually went to Korea a couple of times with him, and we did a lot of sort of peace building on the ground work there as well. That's me. Brilliant. I think we are now going to go into that first step that Dave talked about. We're going to be talking about listening to what is going on and why, so as wartime impinges on your context and calling. And to start, we're going to chat a bit to Annie and find out more on the granular level in the classroom with the kids, what that looks like. I'm also just going to read quite a little bit from her piece, because I just thought this was really pertinent to raise. So you said, my most asked question is, Miss, do you support Israel or Palestine? In a school with predominantly Muslim children, located next to Golders Green, which has one of the largest Jewish communities in the UK, this question about world affairs carries serious undertones of how I should treat my neighbour. So I'd love you to talk a bit about your context.
Did you see me automatically roll up my sleeves when you asked me that question? That's what I do in my classroom. When they ask me a big question, I'm like, right, here we go. So let's do it here. So yes, like I said, I'm a teacher in North London, which I do love. So I'm given those questions every single lesson, I kid you not, okay? As a teacher, obviously, I exaggerate an awful lot, but I'm not exaggerating with that, okay? So these kids are very passionate about what they believe in, and they want to find out if you're on their team. And it's really important for me, as a teacher, to play, well, I don't want to say devil's advocate, because I don't want to be his advocate, but I like disagreeing. So I always try and make sure they have no idea where I belong, what side I belong with. And to be honest, sometimes they ask me questions and I haven't even thought about it yet. And these are 11-year-olds all the way up to 16, I mainly teach, who are all so invested in these huge questions. And I put myself in those situations and thinking, when I was 11, I was playing Club Penguin, I was online, I was just discovering what Facebook was, and here they are with TikTok in front of them on their phones, seeing war crime genocide, and from places where they come from. That there's lots of them, their grandparents were refugees from this crisis that is happening still today. And even so, this is their first ever experience of Trump. They weren't around, well, they were around, but I really hope they weren't on TikTok back then when he first came in. But this is their first experience of seeing him on their screens, and no matter your opinion of him, he's a very boisterous man, so he grabs your attention really, really quickly. So they want to know what my opinion is of this man who's saying an awful lot of stuff about their home countries. And they also want to know my opinion on who I should have thought was president, who I think should be ruling. I asked them the other day, we're learning about the commandments there, the 10 commandments, and I said, right, on your whiteboards, you've got to write down three big rules that you think every single person in the world should follow. And on almost every single one, it will say, everyone has to pay me £1,000. And I'm like, fair enough. But on mostly all of them, it will say, no war, no crime. So I know that this is really something that these kids are facing every single day. And it's sad. I mean, I have to admit, I've got to give penance. This is some stuff that I haven't even thought about before. And these kids are racking their brains in every single lesson, trying to grab absolutely everything they can to bring it back to those kind of questions.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said about the fact that a lot of us are consuming all of this online, and I think it's quite interesting to sort of view wartime through the lens of Instagram or social media, and I think often that will be the primary place that we might see these things happen, and I feel like that's slightly filtered from some of the stuff that you've seen, actually, Alex, and I wonder if you might talk a bit about actually being the person on the front line in the spaces we are just reading about.
I think £1,000 seems like lowballing it. I feel like you should aim a little bit higher. And what I find interesting in this is that when we look at the sort of reflecting on sort of conflict settings, and we spend a lot of our time talking about the symptoms of war, and I think that's where a lot of the focus lies in trying to bring about peaceful solutions. And that makes a huge amount of sense. So looking at governance, looking at security sector reform, looking at the way in which countries will use natural resources, and often these are the things that are being fought over. But I think the interesting thing behind that is really what are the causes? So if they're the symptoms, what are the causes? And in any conflict, I think it's always a good question to ask, like, what's the thing behind the thing? What is it? What is it that's driving that conversation about the the use of resources, or the form of governance, or the type of governance that we want to have in our country, wherever that is. And in my essay, I sort of dug into that a little bit, just sort of looking at more some of the sort of psychological drivers, some of the psychological causes, and that we can understand that lead to conflict. And just sort of super quickly, some of those being around sort of fear of the other, about being humiliated, about having an over moral certainty. Big issues in do I understand my identity? When I misunderstand my identity, I'm likely going to be moving towards a conflict. The way in which we can really easily dehumanize the other. And the fact that we're all a lot more irrational than we like to think. We like to sort of portray as being rational beings when deep down we are less rational than we like to pretend.
Yeah. Mims, I might ask you the same question there, because you were working supporting an MP, and also, again, you mentioned your experience in South Korea and some of those dialogues. What did you notice in terms of what seems to be driving the impulse towards war, and that puts us into these binary positions where it just seems intractable?
So even just going to Korea with my grandfather was such a sort of eye-opening experience. And I remember there being a lot of propaganda on the street. So you kind of walk up the main street in Seoul, you've got the Blue House at the end, and kind of dotted along are these sort of stands. And I mean, if you work or have gone anywhere near Parliament, you'll know them. They sort of set up and they remain. And there might be chants, there might be anthems, and there's lots of propaganda, basically for or against certain leaders or in support of. And it was really fascinating because being in South Korea, there was a lot of positive propaganda. There's quite a strong relationship with America in South Korea. A lot of its culture is formed by it. And so a real sort of camaraderie with America, and some of the propaganda or the posters or the messaging was very much in line with that. And that being really interesting that it's sort of on their streets and displayed. And that coming into the conversations we were having with some of these ROK leaders who are seeking sort of reconciliation with North Korea. There's China in the mix. And you're sort of thinking, you've got these other countries who are leaning into this conversation. You've got various parties you're wanting to keep happy. And even though you're just trying to, in some ways, bring about peace between North and South Korea, you're actually having to balance the influence of these other countries who are you're either in alliance with or in war with, and that being quite a big sort of pressure and push to some of the narratives and conversations we were having around tables. And I remember one of the stark things, I sadly couldn't be in on this meeting, but they were meeting with the North Korean ambassador in Geneva as well, and there was a lot of discussion beforehand. What do we say? What do we not say? How do we sort of diplomatically state our case without too strongly agreeing with someone else who the North Koreans might sort of dismiss us because of. And then being in Parliament, that was really interesting. So we had a lot of sort of Home for Ukraine stuff that we were pushing. People who would be calling the constituency office day in, day out, seeking resolution, seeking housing, seeking help, seeking schools, some with really young kids, and sort of really looking to the UK government and in fact, communities that we all live in, to lean in and help these people as they've been impacted by wars of their own home. So that's some of the stuff, that sort of I came across in that work, which then I think brings it closer to home, especially when you're working in sort of your own country's space of governance and realizing that our communities are spaces of peace for some of these people.
I think another dimension that came into Alan's article, which he might speak to a little bit later, but there's a big business surrounding war. I was just reading about some of the contracts that are going out in terms of the military industry, groups like BlackRock that actually own multiple companies and are supplying arms. Alan will come on to this later, but oftentimes the industries can drive the conflicts. It's not simply supplying conflicts, but often drive them. And sometimes the same company that supplies the arms also has contracts to fix places up after they've burnt them to the ground. So there's a lot of complex dynamics going on. When you hear, for instance, a land grab of certain regions with rare minerals, then you should also read that related to, for instance, the need for superconductors, which are mostly 75% supplied by Taiwan, which also signals that maybe there's some geopolitics going on of who controls which industries and positioning yourself for the future so that you're safer if a conflict comes out. So there's a lot of big forces at play, but we also want to recognize that ideology plays into it. There's pragmatics and economics, but there is also ideology. And in Joshua's piece, he's done quite a bit of research about the importance of the Orthodox Church in Russia, where Kyiv is seen as a center, for instance, of religious identity. And so therefore it's not simply, I'll take these areas where there's mostly Russians, but there's also questions of a reunification of a region with a coherent religious narrative. So it's very, very messy when we start to look at it. But what I want to do now is move into the second movement. And again, we're going to be discussing these in our groups shortly. So thinking in your own context, firstly, listen, what's going on and why? What does conflict look like in your context? But let's now look at imagine. Let's take a more explicitly theological perspective on this. We're imagining what should be going on. We're seeking biblical insight to join God's peaceful mission. I might launch in with you here, Alex. I often get mocked for using the word shalom incessantly, and I think you're the only person, other than maybe a couple, who rival me for the use of the word shalom. And the other thing that I really enjoy is just in the middle of a conversation, you might mention the Imago Dei or the image of God. I don't have many friends in that category who just drop theological, heavy categories like this. Can you talk to us, why are shalom and the image of God so central to how you see the world, how you see the neighbour, and how you understand and engage in places of conflict? Talk to us about that.
I'm really not sure that's a compliment, Dave.
It's a compliment from me. Maybe not from someone else, but it is from me. So.
I was reflecting, rereading, sort of looking at what I'd written in the essay and thinking this is actually quite offensive in certain contexts to turn around and say that every human being carries the image of God. And we look around and, it's true that a lot of people keep that incredibly hidden. And often I think people would maybe struggle to even identify that within themselves. I think people can become so embroiled in conflict that they can lose that sense of understanding. And maybe they don't have the language of the image of God within them, but they might talk about their sort of innate goodness or something along those lines, where there would be a sort of an understanding of that. And for us, navigating our way around conflict settings is incredibly complicated, and thinking of ways how we can do that. So if you believe that your mission is from God, to provide clean water, healthcare to women and children who've been impacted by conflict, then how do you do that? How do you get to that point? And so we in Meta, we talk a lot about how do I identify, locate, and then draw out the image of God that exists in another person. And so step one is believing that Genesis 1, that everybody has the image of God within them. They are made in the image of God. Lots of stories about ways in which, sitting down with people who are on, UN sanctions lists, quite proud of that fact, but needing to negotiate with them, needing to engage with them, and thinking, actually, how do I present myself? How do I present my case? How do I present my arguments in a way that can connect somewhere? And it really is deeply hidden in lots of circumstances with that from within that person. And so I think it sounds offensive. It can sound offensive, but it's also true. Genesis 1. At the same time, we talk a lot as well about everyone's need for divine grace. So if I sit down with somebody on a UN sanctions list, I am in need of divine grace in the same way that they are. And I think when we acknowledge that, when we don't lord it over somebody, that space for dialogue opens up. I think so often people in conflict are so used to being talked down upon, demonized, talked down upon, that actually if you arrive and you sort of and you engage with somebody in that way, then space for dialogue opens up.
I might ask you as well, Annie. I mean, it seems like the other end of the scale here, but there might be a few students that you're wondering, are they on a UN sanctions list? Particularly, on a rainy day. Or maybe it's a sunny day here. Maybe it's the opposite. But teaching can be really chaotic. It can feel like things are out of control and you're drowning. Are there any theological resources for you that help locate the conflicts you're seeing within this larger story of the mission of God? How do you get your theological bearings dealing with conflicts in your classroom?
I bet you've never heard the excuse for not doing your homework was, "Miss, sorry, I was in prison again." I got that the other day. So I'm a fairly new Catholic, been a Christian for a hot minute, but I'm Catholic for a shorter time. And I've really found comfort with the saints. These are real people who found God exactly where they are, and they are far from perfect. And they tell us that every single moment they can. They are the first people to say, I need forgiveness. I need to look to God for help. And in those stories, in those moments, is where I really see God helping me be a peacemaker in my classroom. Honestly, I feel like, well, I'm so lucky to not really have experienced any kind of battle or conflict where I am. But I certainly have internally the turmoil that my kids share with me, the jetting back to the countries because unfortunately someone has died often in these conflicts. Those moments where I can really just shut my ego down and go, God, I need you here. And I don't know why we're so scared sometimes to say that. Maybe it's because we're so used to doing things by ourselves. Maybe it's because things are so far away. But looking to the saints and seeing how easy it was for them to admit defeat and say, God, I need you here. I cannot simply do this without you, is where I really fight those battles in my classroom. Today I went to my happy place twice when it was just getting all a bit too much for me. And in my head, I just sat down at my desk and went, guys, I'm going to my happy place. Give me a moment. But it's in those moments where I'm shooting up a Hail Mary, or I'm grabbing the rosary in my pocket, or I'm really just saying, Lord, I just can't do this. And I open my drawer and I see the holy water in there. And I'm reminded that I'm not meant to do it by myself. And that's how I work out my classroom.
And for you, Mims, when you were doing, particularly in some of the political work, there's a lot of chaos in that space as well. Obviously, image of God, knowing that there's help from other Christian role models that can guide you through. We touched on shalom a little bit. I don't know if that's language that you want to inhabit in this space, but how does kind of a vision of a greater good shape the way that you engage in spaces of conflict where people seem focused on just winning their particular lot, but not looking at a greater good? Yeah.
So I think a lot of writing this piece has been such a joy because I've spent a lot of time with my grandfather. And for those of you who know him, you know that one of the biggest sort of pivotal moments in his career is looking at Matthew 22 and looking at what is the greatest commandment, and that is to love the Lord your God and love the neighbor as yourself. And ultimately, true flourishing, peaceful dwelling is in right relationship and in loving our neighbours, loving those who we live alongside. And it sounds, and later on you'll see a little video of him, it sounds really silly. It's sort of like, love, what do you mean love? And I think I've really, I've been quite impacted by that thinking and sort of thought, actually, if I really believe that the people that I am living alongside, the people who are on the opposite side of the conflict to where I might even position myself, they are an image bearer, they are a neighbor, they are a brother or sister in Christ, or an image bearer. And I look at them and I see who God has made them, and I am called and commanded to love them. And that's quite hard sometimes, and I think we might find that quite hard in any context that we're in, but ultimately the Lord commands us to love one another as ourselves, and I think that is one of the core things in having this discussion with my grandfather and in thinking about peacemaking that seems core to how we do it. And that is by the radical means of loving our neighbour and doing that first and foremost, and seeing who they are and who they've been made in Christ and cultivating that relationship with them, despite the sides of the war that we might find ourselves on.
That's great. So you've just heard a range of responses, and again, the aim of these conversations here is to stimulate your conversation. Because the aim is not simply to hear some position or go, oh, that's generic wisdom. We want you to have the opportunity to think, what does it mean for me to be a peacemaker in my particular context? So what we're going to do is forming in our little groups, we're going to practice what we call triple listening. You might have heard from John Stott years back about double listening to the word, listening to the world. But in a lot of John's work, you actually find triple listening. You find he also talks about word, world, and one another. It's not just abstract or up here somewhere, it lands in people's everyday context. It's centered on the love of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, entering this divine conversation. with God and with each other, a place of hospitality. So in our conversations, you might have already noticed some wisdom coming from God's story, some insights coming from the culture's story, and some aspects of our frontline stories. So here's what we're going to be doing is chatting about these 4 questions, just the first 2 in this spot, of how we be a wise peacemaker by listening to what's going on and why, and imagining what should be going on. We'll do the next 2 later on. But for the next 12 minutes, I'd love you to share with each other your context in which you confront conflict, maybe the fallout from war, and then how do you listen and what do you imagine should be going on? Over to you. Enjoy the conversation. We don't have with us in this session Dr. Michael Schluter, a commander of the British Empire, but he is going to be with us through a 2 or so minute video that Mims and Eric shot coming out of the conversation. We'll make this in its entirety available as part of a landing page with all of the resources from this, because it was a wonderful conversation. But in this video, we're going to hear a little bit from Michael about how he understands and approaches peace building across lines of difference and the centrality of strong relationships therein. So let's watch this video clip, after which I'll bring the panel back up and we'll continue our conversation.
I thought to myself, if God is big enough and interested enough in human affairs to demonstrate his power by defeating Mrs. Thatcher in the House of Commons, couldn't God also bring about the end of apartheid in South Africa? Couldn't God do that if he wanted to? And I realized, of course he could if he chose to. And so I thought, well, if one was to try, as I'd done with the Sunday campaign, start in some tiny way to do something, trusting in God to make it all happen, couldn't he do the same if I put my toe in the water on this issue of apartheid? So that's how I first got into peace building. Track 2 diplomacy is where you're working with people who are close to the leaders, but are not the leaders themselves. So they're much freer to be able to speak their minds and negotiate and explore solutions. We'd sit round an enormous dinner table in the evening, so we'd have about 18, 20 people who'd be invited to a meeting, so small enough for everybody to talk to everybody, but large enough to have representation from a wide variety of different groups. And as they talked to them, they just warmed to them as human beings. And that was as important as anything, I think, in changing their whole mindset. Jesus was asked the question, which is the greatest commandment? Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, and this was the key verse for me, the key saying of Jesus, on these 2 commands hangs all the law and the prophets. I thought, wow, there it is. I was absolutely ecstatic for about 3 seconds. And then I thought, love? So my name's Michael Schluter. I am an economist. I was trained, first of all, at Durham University in the north of England, and then subsequently at Cornell University in the United States. I set up the Christian think tank called the Jubilee Center back in the 1980s. And then after that, increasingly got into international peace building. That was initially in South Africa, and then in Rwanda, and then in Sudan, and more recently in Korea.
So far, we have spent time listening to what's going on and why, and then imagining what should be going on. We now move into the create movement. What do we do in response? How do we respond? We're looking for a better response than what presently is the status quo. We're seeking both practices that change us, but also healing action that affects our environment, that brings God's shalom near. And I thought I might start with you in this one, Mims, before you lead us through this segment. You've worked with your grandfather, you've read a lot of his works in terms of relational frameworks, and you've seen this put into practice, for instance, through some of these multi-day initiatives with people with having time together. So I'll bring up some of the principles that are in your piece of 5 relational principles, but I'm wondering if you could give us a window on how do you action love? It sounds so perhaps abstract or maybe individual, interpersonal, but what does that mean when it comes to something more corporate? Could you talk us through these?
Thanks, Steve. Saying I've read the book is doing some heavy lifting there. So these are the 5 relational principles, and they're expanded on more in the R factor or the relational lens if you're interested in reading further. But these 5 principles came out of a lot of the international peace-building work that my grandfather and RPI did in multiple contexts, and sort of came out of these track 2 diplomacy meetings that he sort of spoke about in the video. So I'm going to sort of just work through them and apply them to some of the contexts we might find ourselves in. So the first one is parity. So what does it mean and what does it look like for people to be treated with respect? How can we be careful when we organize a space where we're bringing people in with conflicting ideas and different views? How can we posture and build and curate a space in which people feel that they can walk in and be listened to and heard and treated with respect? Directness. Now, this is something that I think the online world has made ever so slightly more tricky. And so there's already less face-to-face contact when we have a phone in front of us, when we have the ability to text people. And I think the directness nature of the way that we engage with people when in spaces of conflict is so important. There is so much body language that is lost over the phone, and even tone of voice can't fully convey the meaning of what someone is saying, especially when it's on quite sensitive topics and issues. Continuity. So how regular are these conversations? How regularly are we making the point of being in communication with those that we're seeking to build relationship with, that we're seeking to reconcile with, and we're seeking to peace build with? How are we ensuring that this is not just a one-off moment seeking to seal the deal, but how is this something that we can continue beyond just this initial meeting? Multiplexity. Now, whenever my grandfather talks about this, he says, "Have you seen them on the tennis courts?" And I sort of thought, I've never been on a tennis court. But how do we ensure that when we engage with people that we're seeing them in multiple contexts? Just today I was chatting to a colleague about the fact that I loved going to the staff social the other day because I got to see my colleagues in a context that was completely different to the day-to-day, and it made me sort of see sides to them or hear stories about their life that has an influence and an impact on how I treat them and engage with them when I'm working with them through the day-to-day. So I know it's probably slightly more tricky in sort of actual active war zones, but in the spaces in sort of track 2 diplomacy where you're slightly removed, or even in the spaces that you're in with people who are on opposite side, how do you ensure that your relationship with them is not just in the meeting room, but over a meal or outside or on a walk, or if you like tennis, playing tennis. And then commonality. And so this one is especially important. Where are the things that you can find that unite you, that don't just divide you? Where are the things that you can, really build a relationship over? What are some of the values that you hold, especially when you're working with people of different religious or faith groups? What are the certain things that you can see are the same across both spaces and parties? And before we started this evening, Alex and I were chatting, and we were just saying, when he's confronted with a person that he is seeking to treat, wherever you may have been, these principles, he said, sort of slightly had quite a bit of overlap. And so, I'd love you to expand more. There are some 6 points there.
They're miniature, aren't they? They could be very difficult to read, but if you've read the article and memorised it, as of course you did before coming here this evening, this will just be a jog for your memory. But sorry, Mims.
Alex, if you'd be able to speak to some of those, if not more, and
Thanks, Mims. And we were just saying how if we're reflecting on things and praying and trying to seek godly wisdom, it shouldn't be too surprising that we come up with similar solutions to things. Just on your point, Mims, of I think directness, you call it, about how do we interface, how do we talk, I think a really key thing. There's a great book by a guy called Chris Voss, who is a FBI negotiator. The book's called Never Split the Difference, or Don't Split the Difference, something like that. And he has this thing he calls 738-55. And he said, in communication, 7% is what you say, 38% is your tone of voice, and 55% is how you present yourself. And if you're online, maybe you have the 7%, but you don't have the 93%. So just as you were sharing that came into my mind. And what you can see on the screen are somewhere between sort of like practical tips / ideas that we think about within Meta to help to guide us as we interact in the different places that where we work, and particularly when we're interacting in quite extreme circumstances. I think where it's a little bit different, Mims, to what you're sharing is that often these are sort of like, can be kind of one-off transactional, like I need something, because that's the nature of what we're doing. But I think these would sort of expand even more the more that you can build those relationships. And so I think maybe I'll just pull out a couple of things which will be helpful. One, which I hope is freeing, is that you can engage with a person without validating them. And that's just incredibly important to do that. I think it's much easier for us to retreat into our corners, whether it's a conflict in the office, whether it's Israel-Palestine in school, whatever it is, it's much easier just to retreat and to think, well, if I talk to that person, well, I will validate them sort of morally, ethically somehow. And I was sat down speaking to a colonel in an army whose men had overrun a place we were trying to come in to provide assistance. On the back of it, I was interacting with him, engaging with him. I'd seen all of the things that his men had done, which I won't go into, but you can probably imagine. And I left that interaction feeling quite conflicted, because I was like, he was a nice guy. We talked about the Premier League. We sort of joked and laughed, and he's just overseeing war crimes in this area where we were going to work. And I just felt really conflicted by it.
Probably sick, I imagine.
Yeah, but it like conflicted, sick, sort of just completely upsets your sort of any kind of like moral equilibrium that you might have. But then we were able to go in, provide assistance, medical assistance to the kids, women, children in that area, provide clean water in an ongoing way. And that question is, what I'm doing, does it move towards shalom, or does it move towards sin? I want to move things towards shalom and away from sin. And I think in that example, I had to engage with that person in order to do that.
Yeah, kind of a moral indignation to justify yourself and damn them or deplatform them does nothing to actually help the situation. Yeah, it's really powerful. And in your context, and we can come back in, Alex, if you want to share a few more, but I'll ask just quickly, in your context, what does it mean for you to create change, whether that's in spiritual practices or in the actions? You mentioned finding your happy place at times. What do you do practically to be able to make a more peaceful environment?
Yeah, so I spend most of my life arguing whether Adam was a prophet or not, with almost every child I come across. But in those moments, taking from what you guys were saying is this idea that just to simply find something in common. And my kids don't know that I'm a Christian. They haven't noticed my tattoos that my arm is covered with. I've even got a Trinity tattoo. And is it my teaching that they know that the Trinity is that symbol and they don't recognize it? I don't know. But they don't know I'm a Christian, haven't worked it out. Every time they ask me, I go, So they have no idea, I think. And so I know where I'm coming from with who I believe Jesus is. And I know where they're coming from because I've spent a lot of my life deciding what religion I am. If I'm a religion, which one? What do I believe about these people that I read about all the time in all these different religions? And the main idea in Islam is that Jesus was a prophet. And I'm like, fantastic, I can deal with that. I know he's God, they think he's a prophet. What has TikTok not disagreed with me? That nature is real. So I'm like, brilliant, okay, I can work with this. What does Jesus do? He calms the storm. And that is the bit in common that I can have with them. So when they are bringing this chaos into my classroom, whether it's with their behavior and I take a deep breath, or whether it's with these questions about who do you support, what do you think should happen, who do you think should be president, who do you think should run this country, should taxes exist, all these kinds of things, in that moment, I can teach them behavior management. I can teach them about Jesus calming the storm. And there's so much behind that, because nature is something that does exist no matter what TikTok says. It's something that happens to all of us. My favorite thing is the rain. I love the rain. And people find that horrific. Okay? People find that horrific, and sometimes I'm like, look, I'm British, I was born here. I love the rain. Maybe that's something I'm telling myself, but it's in those moments where I can have that thing in common with my kids. They think he's a prophet, I think he's God. But either way, he performed this miracle where he calmed the storm. And I bring that into their lives. Whether they think that's him from a prophet, or whether that they think that's him as God, that's up to them to decide. That's for not me to dictate to them. And that's exactly the kind of things we need to bring into these conversations. If you can find that tiny mustard seed of something in common, there's so much that can come from that. They leave with questions. They go, well, okay, if Jesus can calm this storm, if he really has sovereignty over nature, what can he do for me? And that, for me, as their teacher, is more than enough.
Brilliant. And I think that leads so well into the final sort of step in our LICC, which is...
I never saw that.
Yeah, right. Which is communicating a better story. How do we share the good news that Jesus reigns even over dictators without firing a bullet? And yeah, even as you were just talking, Annie, it's such a kind of simple and powerful way of bringing into your classroom, just through the curriculum you're teaching, who is Jesus and who do you say he is? And Dave, we're going to start with you on this one. And you've recently been to Ukraine. You've been chatting to ministers who have kind of come to Dnipro Hope for respite. How did you find encouraging them in the good news that Jesus reigns when it just feels so dire and difficult in a war-torn country?
Yeah, thanks, Mims. One thing I was really struck by chatting with many of these pastors and chaplains was that they had a very strange theological problem to solve. One that was their church memberships were something like 10 or 12 people, but their church buildings were full and breaking at the seams, with 250 people crammed into a space looking for hope. So they're trying to work out what does that mean for the, in a Baptist church, for the baptismally regenerated and voting. They're trying to work out what that means. But the reality is that people were coming from everywhere searching for hope. And I said to them, so how has this changed the way you communicate? And a couple of comments they said. One is, if I'm speaking with people and I try and draw something from the Bible and I'm like, like Abraham did, they'll say, who was Abraham? There was a religious or a biblical illiteracy, but there was a plausibility structure that said hope can be found here. And it was the love of the community that made them go there. So I think that's important too, is if we're just looking at words to share, but we're not actually embodying the peace of God, those words will count for nothing. But if people experience in our lives that we are peacemakers, then when times get tough, they will draw near. And we can find people of peace in their community and communicate. So they said you've got to bring it back to simple, and you need to find language that connects. And one of the things that both Joshua and these pastors were saying is you have to start where they are. And where they are is trauma. It's everywhere. If you've got some gospel of, Jesus will make your life better, this is not the reality they're facing at the moment. They're staring down the barrel of potentially being overtaken. And they all have seen war crimes. I couldn't find a person who hadn't seen a war crime. Seriously, like horrible stuff. Drones badgering old women with Zimmer frames and like horrible stuff before shooting, like everywhere. So how do you share the gospel in that? I found in general that I use a 5 circles approach, or 5 phrases that I find helpful, and I'll show what they mean in this context. But those phrases are designed for good, damaged by evil, restored for better, sent together to heal, and God sets everything right. Designed for good, damaged by evil, restored for better, sent together to heal, God sets everything right. And if I relate that to their story, designed for good, that God made us for flourishing. He made us for shalom, to be rightly related with Him, with each other, with our neighbor, with the world, with ourself. We were designed to connect to our Creator. We were designed to love others and flourish together. We were designed to use our gifts to cultivate the world, and we were designed to feel at peace, not anxious. Is that the world you see? No. What do you see? Well, instead we see people acting as though they are God and taking over other countries and taking over empires and building a name for themselves. That's sin. Instead we see people abusing their neighbors and killing them and hurting the innocent. That's sin. Instead, we see people destroying the land with all kinds of fallout ecologically. People not being able to work because they've lost limbs. That's sin. Instead, we see people traumatized, disconnected from family, families pulled apart, people with mental health issues. That is part of the brokenness of the world. And God says this is not the way it's supposed to be. Everything is damaged by evil. Now, what will God do with that? Well, God could come in and He could damn the whole thing, and He could come in with force, but then wouldn't He be a bit like the dictators that we're trying to get rid of? Instead, God gives us agency to make choice, and God steps into the middle as the most vulnerable there could ever be. God Himself born under an oppressor, Roman Empire. God Himself through Jesus, refugee heading down to Egypt. God Himself with scars. That Jesus comes in and He models what it means to love God as your Father, to even love your enemy rather than abusing them, absorbing into yourself the suffering and the sickness and the pain. God Himself in flesh showing what it means to use your gifts as a carpenter and as a preacher to say the way that things should be when God's way is the way and God's rule is the rule and everything works as it should. God in the flesh, at peace with Himself, knowing who He is and not needing to perform or make a name for Himself. And He then models what it means to not only live fully alive, but to pay for all the brokenness and all the sin and all the wrong that's happened. And He's nailed to a torture device of the empire. And He dies, but to show that He has stood in for us and that we can be forgiven through Him, He is raised up 3 days later to show that even when you're facing trauma and death and sacrifice, that there is a path through, that God will vindicate and will raise up those who are aligned with the kingdom of God, which is the way things should be. And that not only we're restored for better, but then He sends His Spirit as a comforter, the healer, the therapist, to guide us through so that we're sent together to heal us from the inside out, so we form a community of peace that we're called to be peacemakers. And that's what it's actually about, is the church coming into these spaces, not just as an institution, but people who love Jesus and are filled with His Spirit, coming into places of pain like you've seen these chaplains doing. Risking their own life. Like you've seen with one of the guys, Genier, who wasn't trusted on the front lines, but he got to know the names of the guys with all these principles we're talking about. And when he did that, he found that they started to open up. Some of these guys hadn't had a shower for 2 months because they'd been on the front line all through. And he opened up his house. They would drop their military fatigues and they'd have showers, and then they'd sleep in the spare beds, and then they'd bring their families over, and then they would be fed. And they'd form into a community, and the people who had amputations would be cared for. This is the church in action, where God fills a group with His Spirit. They're sent together to heal, but they're not going to fix it all up. We're not promised that it's all going to end well here and now, but we are promised that God will set everything right, that God will judge evil, that those who are unrepentant will be damned in a real sense. And that's right for us to say that, because people are damn angry at war crimes. God will judge this. But right here and now, He promises to be with us so that we can be a taste of what things will be when God sets the world right. And that's the good news. that God in Christ is reconciling the whole world to himself. So I found that this kind of language, again, of designed for good, damaged by evil, restored for better, sent together to heal, and God sets everything right, has been helpful in that context. We'll move on in a second, but I'd be interested to hear if there's anything you guys want to add in terms of how you contextualize the good news of the gospel in a context of conflict. Maybe if you first, Annie.
Sure. I mean, I've got to communicate that to kids. So that's a challenge in itself. But what I found, and I'm sure this is the case for, I'm going to say everyone, which I shouldn't say as a teacher, but I'm going to say everyone, is people who've gone through conflict or have those war-torn backgrounds just want to be heard. They want their pain to be heard. And when my kids are asking me, Miss, do you support Israel or Palestine? They're asking me, Miss, do you hear what I've gone through? Do you see what I've gone through? They don't really care about the answer. They just want to feel valued. They don't want their pain to be brushed away. In my article, I said they don't want those neat little phrases like, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek. Obviously, they're amazing for us. They're great instructions, but they want to know that things are going to be better, but their pain isn't going to be forgotten. And I think that's what the cross brings. Jesus' scars are there for a reason. They're not for us to be, wow, amazing, thank you so much, Lord, you've forgiven us, that's great. He goes, look at my hands. Look what I went through so that you can be forgiven. We shouldn't forget that. That pain, that trauma, that suffering. And so when we're having those conversations of conflict, let us remember really what those people have gone through to get here. We don't have to validate what's going on, but we can certainly hear what they've gone through to get there.
Alex, anything for you, and then Mims?
The three things that come into my mind, one is hope that things can be better. Two, that there can be joy in the midst of great pain and suffering. And three, that even in the midst of conflict, that there can be great surprise. There's a verse in Genesis talking about how Isaac and Ishmael, who've had this great feud, that they're able to come together to bury their father. And somebody pointed that out to me relatively recently, and I never really noticed it before. And there's no explanation given for it of why we've gone from a situation of conflict to, we don't know, of reconciliation. But even in the midst of conflict, I think we can be surprised, and we can be surprised at God working for good, and not in a sort of kind of cliched sort of way, but seeing the goodness of people even in the darkest situations. And I think that's good news.
And in some ways, maybe it was even the trauma of losing something that was shared between them, of a father that they both loved, drew them together at a point of loss, representing the kind of font for both Jews and Muslims or Arabs to see that they could come together, perhaps over shared loss. Yeah, thanks. Mims, anything you want to add before we move towards our conversation again?
Yeah, just briefly, one of the things that I've been really struck by is how do we communicate a better story means being in the places where we have the opportunity to do so, where the better story is not being preached, where the gospel is not at home amongst the people in the spaces. And I think as Christians, what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to know the God of justice, what it means to see and believe in a God who is powerful and can reconcile and restore all things. Communicating a better story means being in those spaces of conflict. It means actively choosing to get involved and to support and to go out to Ukraine or to sign a parliament petition or to get involved in those conversations. I think it can be really easy to just engage and see it through the lens of a phone, and I know myself, that's like the first way that I engage. But as Christians, we need to be in those spaces. We need to be salt and light to those conversations. We need to bring hope to those literal front lines. And so I think one of the biggest calls in communicating that story is knowing that we are bearing that story, and therefore we need to go to the spaces that need it most.
Thank you, Mims. I think the panel's done a wonderful job opening up the conversation, but now it is over to you to continue that conversation. So again, we've listened what's going on and why, we've imagined what should be going on. Now we move to the next two questions. Create. How will we respond? How will you respond? What does this mean to be an agent of reconciliation in your context? And communicate. How do you share the good news of the gospel in a way that makes sense, whether it's to students or it's to war criminals or it's to MPs? Sometimes we can't tell the difference between these groups, sometimes we can, but this is your time to have that conversation. So about the next 10 to 12 minutes, you'll be in those groups, and again, where you hear the music swell with the times they are changing, please do grab your seat, and then we'll move to the last segment of the night, which is Q&A, questions and comments with the panel as well. Thank you. So enjoy your conversation. So we're now moving towards, we're moving into the Q&A time, questions and comments as well. But I wanted to start with one of the other authors from the series. Dr. Alan Storkey has written a really important piece on walking backwards towards disarmament. Essentially, he's looking at the problems of militarization. I have here his book, Militarism Has Failed. You'll also notice that there's a QR code there. Alan may speak to this in his couple of minutes comment here, but he's set up a petition, which is a really important one, basically lobbying governments to consider lessening progressively the kind of militarism of their country, so that we might be able to see some unilateral decreases rather than this constant amping up. But Alan, we'd love to hear from you as first respondent from the night. Are there things you want to add, or is there something you'd want to ask of the panel?
So this is going to move quite fast, so I apologise, but I've got 2 or 3 minutes and a lot to get into.
Sure, thank you.
So first of all, we're almost there. There's a false power, which is the power based on arms, the power to destroy, and it's dominated the world since the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, present US policy, and all the rest of it. This power controls other people, it exploits other people, and it is wicked and long-term. So that means we're fighting all the superpowers. That's the Christian war we face. Now, we shouldn't lose heart, first of all, because we're looking at a failed system. Okay, we've already seen the failures in a load and load of comments, and we could go on and on and on. The costs run into hundreds of trillions. We have 120 million war refugees. Roughly 10% of world CO2 comes through militarism and war, and a whole range of other things. So the war is on, and we Christians need to wake up. At present, the churches are asleep. Churches are doing lots of good things. They're awake in some areas, but in this area, they're asleep. Third, we have to understand how we fight. And I've studied the people who thought this through, a lot of them in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Tolstoy was outstanding, the world's greatest novelist, but really the world's greatest peacemaker, and lots of others too. So how do we fight? Well, first of all, it's a big problem, so it needs a big solution. We don't strain at gnats and swallow camels, we look at the camel. And the big solution, we know from the scriptures, is arms into plowshares, that they learn war no war, that we bring down the mighty from their thrones. So we're out to get rid of the whole military system. How do we do this? Well, we fight in the way the scriptures tell us to. How do we fight? Well, we stand. We stand in the armor of God, which attacks nobody. We have no enemies, but the armor does the work. Feet shod with the gospel of peace and the rest of it. We love our enemies. Who are the fighters? Well, actually, we have 2 billion Christians around the world. We have an army of 2 billion, which is roughly 300 times bigger than the 28 or so million troops that there are around the world. So all we have to do is to understand that we mobilize the whole army of God. And quite frankly, if you've got 25% of the world electorate behind you straight away, you can do anything, provided we see that this is the way we act. So what do? We fully disarm the world. We go round the superpowers because the superpowers are locked into their system. They can't do anything. They're helpless. The mighty are helpless. The scriptures teach us that time and time again. So we go round the superpowers with a petition. This is a petition, but we can have hundreds of petitions and so on. And we are counted as being for world disarmament. It nearly happened in 1932 at the Geneva Disarmament Conference under proposals from the US President Hoover. Okay, but it was stopped by the militarists, and then Hitler got in, and we had World War II. That is worth a lot of study. So the question is it practical? A little bit of homework shows that actually systems of practical disarmament are not at all difficult. We can find weapons anywhere. We all disarm at the same speed. We repurpose arms companies and subsidize them as they move over to other purposes. And we tax anybody who doesn't conform, and we get rid of weapons. We can do it around the world, as we've done it within most states like Britain and European countries. America, of course, hasn't disarmed internally, and 1 million have died through gun killing since the year 2000 there, because they haven't disarmed. So we disarm, and we do it with something like this petition. And we realize that what we have to do, it's really so simple, is to make peace, as Jesus said in the Beatitudes. And making peace just involves each of us doing our little bit of making. For he said, your faith can move mountains. Surely Jesus was exaggerating. Faith can't move mountains. 2 billion mustard seeds can move this mountain. We just need to recognize it's the case.
Thank you, Alan. Could we give Alan a round of applause? Obviously, there'll be a range of different approaches in terms of how we do this, but I think we must grapple with Jesus' teachings and what that means in our context as well.
I just wanted to affirm what you said, Dave, about the 5-point design for good, damaged by evil, and so on. In the context of this evening, that was one of the most powerful summaries that I've heard of the gospel, and I think is worthy of further reinforcement and dissemination. I think it really connected with this audience and could connect very strongly with other audiences. So I just wanted to encourage that, really.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And just to note, for me, where I first came across that was James Chong, who was an InterVarsity worker for many years. He wrote a book, True Story, A Christianity Worth Believing In. And he critiqued how often our understandings of the gospel, particularly in Western Protestantism, are individual rather than community. They're the afterlife versus this life. They're a moment of conversion versus ongoing transformation. They don't often involve mission. And instead of the individual located in community and creation, they just reduce to something abstract and immaterial and a hope after you die. And actually, that's not the heart of the good news. The heart of the good news is that God reigns through Jesus, who is Lord of all. And so re-understanding the way that we frame the gospel as centered on allegiance to Christ and the reign of God is crucial, particularly when we look at these larger questions of things like ecology, which massively wraps up with war as well. And as we look at questions of militarization, we need a bigger gospel and a better story, which the world is longing for. Thank you, Paul. Some other comments or questions from those who are here? Great, thank you. Maybe just say your name first and then your comment or question.
Hi, Trevor Taylor. Thank you, Dr. Storgy, for what you said. It resonated a lot, but what we've got at the moment is a government that is cutting benefits to increase defence spending. Germany has changed its constitution so it can borrow money to buy arms. I think the Chancellor was saying we're going to boost our defence industry, i.e. armaments industry, through this increase of spending. I mean, how realistic is peacemaking in this climate?
Who would like to speak to that one? Because I'm happy to do a hospital pass and give that to someone else. But I will start with a quote, which I'm searching for in the background here. A quote from John Stott. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. I just was on the train this morning reading his from the 2006 fourth edition of Issues Facing Christians Today, his chapter on war and peace. And he said, I accept the argument that immediate unilateral disarmament might well, in the case of nuclear weapons particularly, make nuclear war more rather than less likely. It might tempt an enemy to exploit our self-imposed weakness. I'm not necessarily saying I entirely agree, but I just want to say there's a range of positions as to what it means to hold weapons as a deterrent, even if we don't want to use them morally. That's a conflicted position, but that is part of the reality in a fallen world of how do we stay the hand of a superior power that is clearly wanting to use that power in a way. So I'm not taking a line there. I agree in principle with what Alan's saying as well, but I am saying that it's a morally complex question of what it means to seek the good and restrain evil in a context where someone is imposing themselves in such a way that it's causing great damage. That's a very complex question. But did anyone want to speak to this beyond the tidbit that I've probably just misused? Alex, I think it's you, mate. Sorry. You're going to have to take it for the team.
I was trying to think, how can I hold on to some hope in the midst of the situation that you very well described. We are living through the breakdown of the post-Second World War settlement, the settlement that we've all grown up within. We don't see the full impact of that as yet. We're sort of returning, it feels like we're returning towards a Hobbesian world. And sort of, so Hobbes's Leviathan, so sort of, the idea of kind of competing powers sort of between each other. So how do we be peacemakers in the midst of that? There's obviously the sort of the question at the state level. I actually think, to go back to sort of the previous comment, that I think now is an amazing time for us as Christians, for us as the church, to be articulating a better story. And again, I don't see that to try to be glib, or to try to sort of, to try to deflect. And, we can talk more about the various geopolitical things that are happening. But I think sort of for the first time, at least in my lifetime, it sort of feels like the meta story that we are engaging with as a society is up for debate, is open for question. And because everything is crumbling around us, a lot of the architecture that we have taken for granted is crumbling around us. And so actually now I think there is a huge opportunity for us as the church, as Christians, to articulate a better way, a better story, a better narrative on all of the issues that you brought up.
I might go another question from the group. And again, there's nothing definitive about any of these responses, but we're hoping it's sparking a better conversation, at least pushing us to think. Up the back there, if you could just share your name and then your comment or question, that would be great.
Hi there, my name is Will. I had a question. We were talking a little bit about the classroom issue. You were saying of polarization of position. On the Middle East issue that you raised. And I guess the question we were sort of grappling with a little bit was, how do you stay engaged with issues of injustice that are affecting humanity, so not turning our back on it, but how do we then stop short of recreating the conflict in England when, to some extent, it's not a conflict directly here, but it feels like that you can't win, because you either turn your back on injustice and humanity and try to shut the door to it, or we sort of engage in it to such an extent that we create our own conflict about another conflict.
That's such a good question. I think, well, my classroom context is unique in the fact that it is real for them because they've still got family in the Middle East. So what I'm saying to them is their grandparents or even their parents. Some have come over without parents. Their parents are still there. So I'm speaking into those contexts. However, I think I originally, when I became a teacher at that school, had that same issue of, well, it's not here. So do I just ignore it? Do I just say, well, that's not for now? The classic teacher argument, why don't you go home and you come back and tell me what you think, is what all teachers normally say. And then I very quickly realized it is in our homes because it's on their phone. I think even though it's not directly happening here, and thank goodness, it's in their bedrooms, it's in their living rooms, it's in their hotel room, wherever they are. These conflicts are present here, and it may not seem like it because we don't have the air raid sirens that was shown so powerfully in those videos, or we don't have the bombing threats. We don't have that. We're in a privileged position, of course, but these conflicts aren't that far away. These conflicts are literally in a moment when you turn on your phone. And I got rid of social media because I just couldn't handle it anymore. I was getting so many questions in my classroom about all of these things. Miss, is World War III going to happen? Constantly from my specifically year 7s. These are 11-year-olds asking me if World War III is going to happen. And I kid you not, I had an argument with one of them the other day about when World War II actually was. So they don't even know the context of these world wars, and yet they're asking me this huge question, well, Miss, is World War III going to happen? So it's such a good question because I think it's very easy to assume, like I did, that these aren't present here. Can I just turn my back on it? Can I leave it for a rainy day? But I very quickly realized, both myself and from what the kids were telling me, that it is here, even if it's indirectly. So I think that's the attitude I have to have. If I have the attitude that it's not here, and we don't have these battles right now, we don't have these conflicts here, then I'm not being a good peacemaker. If I'm saying, well, it's not in front of me, how can I be this peacemaker that Jesus wanted me to be? Because when Jesus was talking to us, he wasn't just talking about then. We can read Jesus in the Bible and see and feel him speaking to us right now. And I always say to my kids, I was like, if Jesus was alive now, Jesus literally popped onto the earth right now, he wouldn't know how to use an iPhone. He wouldn't know how to turn on a laptop. He didn't have to go for any of that. And yet when we read his word, we can feel him speaking to us in our context. So I think I have to go in with that mindset, otherwise I'm not being the peacemaker that they need me to be.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move towards just wrapping up the conversation, but I'm also painfully aware that this is just the start of a conversation. And so I hope that maybe you'll stick around, chat with each other, but that perhaps you'll pick up some of these resources and you might continue this in your own context, whether that's in a class, whether that's in a workplace, whether that's in a church or a small group. Final couple of quotes here that I found just literally this morning as I was reading through. John was saying, there has never been a time when it has been more important for the world to act in concert to bring about peace. The world needs militant peacemakers. That's a phrase that I think Alan was kind of almost, I could hear echoing in his language, that we are called to fight, but to fight in a very different way. I think that's only more true since when John Stott said that in the 2006 edition. And the final line in the book, God is a peacemaker. Jesus Christ is a peacemaker. So if we want to be God's children and Christ's disciples, we must be peacemakers too. Not simply the absence of conflict, but the seeking of shalom in right relationship with God, with neighbor, nature, and self. So I want to take a minute now of silence. And in this minute, I don't know what that sound was, but in this minute, I want us to consider, what is the Lord calling me to do in response as a wise peacemaker? What's just one thing coming out of this conversation that God is saying to you, here is a way to action this, to pray, to meet your neighbor, to cross those lines of difference, to call out the image of God in the other person. I don't know what that is. But in this minute, let's have silence to pray. And if nothing is coming to mind, at the very least, let's have a minute of silence to acknowledge the incredible suffering at the moment of so many people who are in war zones that are active and those who have experienced the fallout from that. So let's take a minute now and ask the Lord, and then we're going to have a prayer together, which I'll introduce, and we'll pray that. Let's take a minute. God, be with those in their pain and give us courage to follow you. Amen. The very last thing I want to do together is a very common prayer that you've heard, attributed widely to St. Francis, whether he wrote it exactly or it's capturing the spirit of St. Francis. You might know that in 1219, during the Crusades, he heard of how badly things were going and all of this violence done in the name of God. And he crossed land and ocean, a lot of it barefoot, to go to Egypt to meet the Sultan, who was about the same age as him, and literally walked across through lines of battle, and they found him so strange that they let him approach. And he came and offered peace, and they talked for hours, and he shared the gospel. And the Sultan didn't convert, but he found him so compelling a figure that it did lead to some of the negotiations that led to about 8 years of a kind of a slowing down of some of the conflicts, because there was mutual understanding by someone who took the risk to cross lines. So I'd love if we could stand and close by praying this together, and then I'll wish you well for your night. Let's all say this together. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. May the peace of the Lord be with you. Amen. Be blessed. Take care.